we are seeing large layoffs at several big tech companies happening right now. Amazon, crypto obviously, but also machine learning companies. So there is large layoffs across the board. So it seems that the disruptors are being disrupted, or they maybe rather started to disrupt themselves. And the reason has probably not even anything to do with tech in particular, but rather with the fact that quantitative easing is sort of being phased out. So there is a lot of excess liquidity to fund, startups or to invest in crypto ventures. And this is, of course, again, a function of the overall situation. As I said, pandemia, inflation, and war. And then I started noticing, in the context of all of this, that the new internet might as well be no internet whatsoever. It happens already sometimes in many places. When I'm trying to talk to my collaborators in Kiev, sometimes this can get very sketchy. It has become a feature of the energy wars to attack basically infrastructure, communication infrastructure, heating, electricity, all kinds of power infrastructure. And this has made it very, very clear to me over the course of the past few years that the internet and current information infrastructure can first of all not be taken for granted, but secondly also cannot be separated from issues of energy extractivism, energy wars, fossil extractivism, etc., etc. Because it's very simple, and one protagonist will also talk about it later. If you don't have energy, if you don't have power, there is no internet whatsoever, there is no digital technology of any kind. You cannot access your crypto wallet either. There is no Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. Any stupid autocrat can simply divorce you from access or make it very difficult to access. So fossil extractivism and energy supplies are intimately related to forms of extractivism, like extractivism of data, of labor, of attention, the things we used to talk about more in detail in tech criticism. As Noam mentioned, I want to tie this back to this old essay I wrote, which was called In Defense of the Poor Image. And I want to trace, the transformation of this idea into what I call power images now. So it's from poor images to power images. And I wanted to show you this old work of mine, which is called Factory of the Sun, or I just wanted to show you a clip from this, which is a fictional video about a group of dancers who are being motion captured, and their energy is being extracted by an evil entity called Deutsche Bank to turn dance into energy, to accelerate the speed of light, to accelerate high frequency trading, etc. So it is already a story about extracting power. So what is the relation then of energy to image, of sunlight to machines? This was based on a quote by Donna Haraway. She wrote that our machines are made of pure sunlight. So I wanted to explore what is the relation between machines and sunlight? What is the relation of power to poverty and of current to currency? Or what a writer named Peter Sandy calls economy, and what I will later call emergy. So, as I said, I wrote this text around 2009 called In Defense of the Poor Image, which was about image resolution online and online circulation of images. It was about the fact that during this time in early YouTube, there was a lot of proliferation of online low resolution videos. And this was an ambivalent fact because it both enabled people to see works which hadn't been accessible for quite a long time, but also this was only possible basically within the enclosed silos of platforms. And this created some kind of image resolution hierarchy. The low resolution ones were, just circulated for free, more or less as appetizers for onboarding into the machine. And the more high-res ones were, you had to pay for them, basically, and they retained some sort of higher aesthetic status. And in the meantime, many of those conditions have changed, but others haven't changed so much. Here is some set of numbers, or this is a prediction actually, which is already a few years old, which predicted that the communications industry could use 20% of all the world's electricity by 2025. And it said that especially different forms of video streaming were not only growing, but taking a lot of, global internet traffic or IP traffic. 82% of all IP traffic, for example, and internet traffic would grow a lot during the period up to 2021. I guess in reality it grew by a lot more because 21 was the period when many people just were sat at home watching Netflix. And this streaming of Netflix movies is actually something that's quite energy intensive. If you spend 1 hour streaming a video on Netflix, it's about 1 gigabyte of data in a lower resolution case. So the energy you use for every hour of video streaming is comparable to using a hairdryer for 30 minutes per day for a year, or running an air conditioner for 16 hours. So that's quite a lot. Or you could also run a hairdryer for 170 days per year for 1 hour of Netflix. But right now in 2021, there was not 1 hour of video in the networks, but there was 5 million years of video being streamed every month, which is quite a lot. It's about 5 times the existence of Homo sapiens, the version of human we belong to. And it would take more than 5 million years to watch the amount of video that is being streamed in a single month in 2021. Every second, 1 million minutes of video content are being streamed. And it was already in 2011 that 2 guys called Bharat Raghavan and Justin Ma at USC Berkeley and ICSI came up with a quite interesting measure for that. They took on the task of estimating the amount of electricity which the internet requires, and that included also the power needed to build the computers, the network connections, the cell phone towers, all sorts of other hardware. And they called this measure Embodied Energy, or Energy. And I would like to just slightly bend this term to apply it to images, and then we will call it imagery. What is an image in relation to power? How much power is being invested into certain images or specific images? And so actually it turns out it's a bit complicated to calculate that. It depends on how many people are accessing that data, where that data is located, etc., etc. So it's a bit tricky to try to calculate the image. It will vary widely. Even if you have the same image, the type of circulation network it is embedded in will define the imagery which is basically spent to achieve its circulation. But I think this term could be quite useful to highlight processes of transformation between physical and social energies, between metaphors and matter, between the world and its image. And so now we are in 2023. I have to get used to it. I still think it's 2022. But so right now, the internet uses around 6.2% of global power expenditure. And basically, people from big data companies will tell you that a lot of effort is being made to use renewable energy for data centers, etc., all of which is partly true. But fact is also that only 20% of this energy is green so far. 80% is still derived from fossil sources. So that's quite a lot, which means that most of the internet is still running on fossil energy, and with it, of course, also the images that circulate on it, etc. And it's very clear that all of this has a carbon footprint, that it affects climate change, consequences for food, water safety, migration patterns, public health, you name it. Wars, obviously, also in the recent year, or more than that, way longer than that, actually. So the power image, in contrast to the poor image, is thus an operational image, because it acts on the world by the way of the medium power or energy. This is its connection. It doesn't, work on the world or impact the world via representation, but in a non-representational way by consuming power. And this, of course, became very clear a little while later during the NFT craze of 2021. I will not go through the technical process. It's very intransparent, and explaining it doesn't make any sense. So suffice to say that to mint NFTs under the proof of work protocol, a lot of energy was required to basically inscribe those items onto the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, or whatever kind of Ethereum blockchain, sorry. This had a lot of different impacts, political, but also, of course, environmental. And during the year 2021, I focused with two of my collaborators, Miloš Trakilovic and Gago Gagoshice, on the phenomena of crypto mining in Southeast Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Along this whole trajectory, there was a whole boom of crypto mining farms which sprang up in specific locations. And I got really fascinated by one small detail, which was that in the beginning of 2018, millions of digital clocks started lagging in Europe. So basically, in the course of the months, 3 minutes just disappeared. And in February, 3 more minutes disappeared. So 6 minutes had somehow vanished from existence. And the reason was that crypto mining, or a lot of crypto mining in Kosovo, had caused these electric clocks to slow down because of power fluctuations in the grid shared between Kosovo and Serbia. So because there was this huge, lot of mining going on in this location, the grid became unstable, the clock slowed down, and the time sort of vanished and disappeared. This is a quote from a press text around that issue, which explains why, this kind of crypto mining sprang up in this place, which between Kosovo and Serbia, which is a place which has been in conflict for many, many years, irresolved, frozen conflict, which enables basically inhabitants from the northern parts of Kosovo to use electricity for free because they simply haven't been paying for it for 2 decades. And this means that many crypto mining operations have been moving there, causing a lot of different problems. So crypto mining was banned finally in the end of 2021, because there have been power reductions due to the serious energy crisis. Remember, this is before even the Ukraine war, and there was lots of bust on this kind of rigs, and self-created mining farms. Equipment was confiscated. The cost of video graphic cards fell dramatically. Everyone who wanted to render 3D content was very happy about it. But anyway, so basically mining happened in many places in border areas between locations that had some tensions with one another, like on the border of Abkhazia and Georgia, where there was a lot of mining going on, is still some mining going on within the same conditions. Same thing happened in different parts of Kazakhstan, which was rocked by energy riots in 2022, in the beginning of 2022. There it was a sudden and steep increase in the cost of liquefied petroleum, which sparked riots, which went on for quite some time, turning into violent protests, and also the turning down of the internet and social media. And here I wanted to show you an interview which we did during that time, but unfortunately we cannot hear the sound. But I will just scroll through briefly because I really like this interview. It's an interview with a young member of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan who explained to us how mining worked in this country, how basically everyone had been doing it because China outlawed miners. So they went to Kazakhstan, they started to build. Fortunately, there's some kind of subtitles so you can read what he's saying all about it. So everyone is getting mining farms, the cousin. We have another interview where the protagonist says the friend of his mother's hairdresser also got herself a mining farm, etc., etc. So the demand for videographic cards was extremely high, and the power expenditure rose by a lot, caused power instability. As the protagonist said, they couldn't use several appliances at the same time. And then also combined with a price hike in gas, this started to trigger riots, which became quite violent quite quickly and led to the whole internet being shut down, more or less. The funny story, which he will tell later on, is that the Communist Party was among the only ones who were still online, because they used a port to connect to the internet, which was used by the banks. But they were very disappointed because they were the only ones online. So there was no point of being on the internet because there was no one to talk to except themselves. So they went to the streets instead. Yeah, so basically this work deals a lot with interviewing different people in many locations, Tbilisi, also a guy from Slovenia, and so on and so on. And this led me to basically try to connect this to another idea, namely the concept of crypto-colonialism. This is a term which an anthropologist named Michael Hertzfeld already came up with in 2002, so way before, any sort of cryptocurrency was invented at all. And he defines it as a sort of indirect economic colonialism. It's an indirect form of oppression, quote, curious alchemy whereby certain countries, which are buffer zones between the colonized land and those as yet untamed, were compelled to acquire their political independence at the expense of massive economic dependence. And I was wondering whether one could use this term for this kind of situation, especially keeping in mind those mining operations, in Eastern Europe and beyond, where definitely crypto was being mined, not on top of electricity, but on top of political instability. Crisis was basically the main raw material which was used to mine crypto in these locations. Here's a very weird example. This is, I have no idea what this is or whether this is even for real, but this is about an entity, crypto entity called WorldCoin. And in order to get it for free, people in some countries of the global south, including Indonesia, as far as I recall, they had to get their iris scanned by this weird kind of orb to basically submit their biological data, biometrical data, in exchange for some entirely fictional, so-called thing called WorldCoin, which captured very clearly the idea of the monetization of identity on demand in poor populations. And this may be an example of crypto-colonialism as happened in the last very few years, formal independence, but economic dependency. And this is also why I've been very, very skeptical about blockchain projects trying to solve basically or to relieve hardship in crisis-ridden parts of the world, because the basically precondition for crypto mining, as I said many times already, is crisis. This is basically the raw material. It's not gonna basically, or maybe in some cases, help to solve crisis, but it needs crisis to exist. And this is why I've been skeptical to use it as a sort of humanitarian device, because additionally it draws people into NGO economies, which can be also interpreted as a different type of crypto colonialism in the meaning of indirect colonialism. And this whole period of mining political instability, as you all know, spawned its own image genre, namely the NFT. And this is a famous NFT. It's also a famous meme. It was minted, and we don't know where exactly it was minted, whether it was in Kosovo or Kazakhstan, but it was minted somewhere there, I'm sure. This is a meme called Disaster Girl, and the girl in the photo called Zoe Ross sold the original copy as an NFT for 180 ETH, which at that time was almost $500,000 US. And I'm not going to explain what NFTs are mainly because, as I said, it doesn't make a lot of sense in the first place. But the question is really, how does this kind of art gain value or get value? And in the case of NFTs, there was a very interesting tool, namely fire. They basically gain value by being burned. And that was a whole subgenre of crypto art, which was physical art. This is, I think, Damien Hirst, who is burning some paintings of his to basically transition them to NFTs. It's really almost like a ritual of sending physical items into an afterlife by sort of ritually burning them, which means that destruction really became a important means of production, and a lot of art was burned this way. Maybe if Damien Hirst wants to burn his paintings, it's not such a big, problem for art history, but this is a drawing by Frida Kahlo, burnt by a millionaire collector called Martin Mobarak, was valued at $10 million and burned, as you can see, to make an NFT out of it. Here is a group of crypto investors burning a work by Banksy in 2021. This is a detail of Banksy's work, which was called Morons, in brackets white, and it satirizes auction that happened in 1987, a record-breaking sale of a Van Gogh sunflower painting that was sold to a Japanese buyer at the time, setting an auction record of 22.5 million British pounds at Christie. And this also happened in the context of the first attempts at art fractionalization, which is an attempt of breaking down art again to sell off the fragments and maybe increase its value on the way. Now, I wanted to talk a little about fractionalization, which was also a process in Western archaeology to break down basically archaeological artifacts into smaller pieces to increase their price and to be able to smuggle them out of the country and basically steal them. And the smaller, bigger reliefs, for example, this is an Assyrian relief called the Winged Genus from a location in Nimrud in northern Iraq, which in the meantime has additionally and equally been destroyed by Daesh as well. But as I said, this method already existed, breaking art down into smaller pieces in order to increase the value of each one. And this was also auctioned at Christie's. When was it? In 2018, it was equally record-breaking, achieved $30 million price, and kindled fears, of course, that more reliefs, archaeological artifacts, could basically be looted on demand and broken up and fractionalized on demand and smuggled out of that location, which again is pretty precarious and unstable. So let's move to the question, what kind of technology is fire then? We've talked about, breaking, but more generally, I'm talking about burning as a means of production, burning the crisis, basically burning political instability in order to produce images. So what kind of technology is fire? And it's a very old technology, most obviously. It's mentioned in Greek mythology as in the story of Prometheus, who steals the fires from the gods. And of course, this represents technology as a whole, and humans have to steal it from the gods and so on and so on. But also, let's say, in a more anthropological and less mythological sense, scientists have claimed that fire is the most potent technology ever because it basically enabled the human body as it exists today to come into existence by way of cooking. So basically the theory is as followed: by cooking food, more energy could be used by the body and the brain was able to grow. Other scientists have also claimed that language is a skill or a technology which was developed through, sitting around campfires at night and talking to one another. It's called the so-called grandmother hypothesis. And what I really like about all these ideas is that they are basically talking about, what is also called domestic labor. It's childcare. The grandmother hypothesis is that the grandmother is taking care of all the children in the group, and cooking, of course. And that these two technologies brought humankind into existence, into its current form. So they are, in a way, I don't know, post-human technologies in a way. Yeah, there's also one more interesting detail in relation to that, is that anthropologists claim that fire produce what they call time colonization, which means that time was basically freed and opened up. The whole night became, a time where you could have social activities because you had some light and warmth, etc. And before, it wasn't really possible to use that time for communication. So they call the consequence of fire time colonization, spawning activities like storytelling and so on and so on. And I think in the current day use of fire as a tool of creative destruction, we rather see the contrary. If we think back to this example of the Serbian Kosovo border crypto mining, which somehow dissolves time or disappears time, very literally. It disappears time, it disappears, or it destroys and breaks up art and drafts people into the system of crypto colonialism, because this is something that many people have articulated as a theory, that NFTs were never about themselves, they were never about art. They were basically like freebies created for onboarding people into a technological environment. So they had to learn about, using wallets, using exchanges, getting their head around what a ledger is, etc., etc. So they were being trained basically to use a whole lot of different tools and to get used to the whole idea of participating in a crypto economy. But also, of course, those same people were not only drafted into that environment, but also into an extractive environment of burning up energy on a massive scale and mining assets on the base of political instability. So onboarding happened into that paradigm of burning, etc. So this brings me to my next example. Actually, it's two different examples, two different types of energy wars and two different types of large-scale data sets. And I just want to contrast them off one another. One is hopefully over and historical, and I would like to compare it to a contemporary one in order to see how to overcome the contemporary one. This is something which obviously has burned already, and it is a basement in an old disused airport, which is in the vicinity of mine in Berlin, called Templehof Airport, which was a major Nazi prestige building. And this site now is used as a park. It's not anymore an airport. It has, by some kind of plebiscite, been turned into a non-real estate development area, so it's used as a park. And I was always extremely fascinated by this location, which is set in a basement under the airport, and which is called the film bunker. And this film bunker still looks like this. It was destroyed at the end of World War II under unclear circumstances, but we know that it housed a huge lot of aerial surveillance photographs for military surveillance. They were taken by some subsidiary of Lufthansa airline that is engaged in espionage. So they would fly around and photograph, all sorts of sites from above to mark them out for invasion, partly also colonization, but also energy extraction. And I will get to that in a minute. And it blew up. It doesn't exist. Some of the photographs were basically existent as copies in other archives. You see they utilize some sort of stereoscopic early 3D technology to be able to create, precise 3D mappings of certain areas. And many of the photos have connections to very surprising projects of energy extractivisms during World War II, which I actually have never heard about. So, for example, there was one expedition to Antarctica to photograph it from above and map it via aerial photography on the premise that Germany needed energy, so it needed whale oil, so it needed to invade Antarctica to be able to procure whale oil. So basically, this whole expedition was sent out in order to prepare the invasion of Antarctica. This is for real. They really went and they called it New Swabia land. And many of the landmarks like mountains, etc., in Antarctica are still called after participants of that expedition. And unsurprisingly, later on, this spawned a lot of conspiracy theories of, members of the Nazi elite still being set in Antarctica in some kind of ice bunker or something that became very, very popular. That theory during pandemia again. Was a favorite anti-vax and corona denier conversation topic. But the real photos of that expedition were probably housed inside this film bunker, as this is a different extraction project, which was supposed to happen in a projected German Nazi colony called German Middle Africa. And this is about palm oil. They wanted to have huge palm oil plantations in that area, but this required to invade these territories and take them away from the territories of Belgian Congo and French West Africa, and that never happened because the war went in a different direction. But very meticulous plans were being made in order to make it happen, down to planning already the housing for the German overseers and making meticulous plans about who could sleep with who, etc., etc. Okay, so basically this is an old paradigm. You have a large-scale database on the one hand, which is photographic, military, basically made by means of aerial photography. And on the other hand, you have basically plans for invasion, extraction, and energy wars. So now I would like to go to the current day example. And so what is basically the image category that corresponds to the current energy paradigm in Berlin? If you go upstairs from this film bunker in Templehof, what you see are these temporary homes for Ukrainian refugees who have been living there since last year. So basically, the consequences of the energy war are already very, very visible in that whole location. And obviously that energy war is also very, very closely connected to an energy paradigm characterized by a system of gas pipelines between Germany or Europe and the Soviet Union, where most of our energy is being taken from. And this whole circumstance has played a huge role in the current war against Ukraine. It also plays a role in me sitting here under 3 blankets. Well, I'm giving this lecture, even though it's not very cold. It could be much worse. So basically the collapse of this whole system of extraction and energy for many people, also including myself, made it really visible and palpable for the first time. There's this whole, Nord Stream, etc., mini pipelines gas system, which is hardwired infrastructure, which has been there for a quite long time, actually since the 70s. 1973, and now it creates this whole, or it is implicated into basically a new energy war and the lack of energy resources. So I was wondering, what kind of type of image generation corresponds to this situation or to this energy crisis? And again, I mean, of course, everyone knows what the current paradigm of image generation is right now. It is basically prompt generated machine learning renderings by generators such as DAO E2. This is Stable Diffusion, whose CEO helpfully compared his technology to Prometheus, again bringing fire from the gods of creativity via his application. So basically, this is the next generation of creation by means of fire in town. And it happens during these times of massive energy crisis, at least where I live. And again, to tie it to the location I'm talking about, basically the airport in Templehof, one could say that the gas pipeline system at some point really ended in this location because most of the people and politicians involved in maintaining this network, even though it was already clear that it would create huge political problems, they were clinging to it, a sort of German political, but also economical, industrial elite who wanted to still, use the cheaper Russian gas in order to have profits for German industry, and all of them assemble in the same airport building to open an art exhibition, which interestingly was called Diversity United, whose patrons included our federal president, but also Russian President Vladimir Putin. And this is basically just upstairs from the film bunker. The history of this pipeline system is quite interesting, first of all, because almost no one knows it. As I said, it starts in 1970 when there is a series of contracts being made between the German and the Russian government. Initiated by a person called Otto Wolf von Amerongen, whose first business deals were selling looted Jewish stocks and assets for the Nazi government on Swiss exchanges during the war to procure foreign currencies to buy raw materials to build weapons. And he is basically the mastermind of this whole pipeline network, which culminates in the pipeline projects Nord Stream 2, destroyed luckily a while ago, or strongly damaged. And this ended in Siberia on a half island called the Jamal Peninsula, on which there is many still traditional reindeer herders who have been massively affected, of course, by this gas extraction for decades, and now are being affected even more because of climate change, etc., etc. So basically the herds, the reindeers, are displaced from that area because the gas line cuts across their traditional migration routes and so on. This is an interview with an activist from that area. So now I would like to come back and compare, these two sets of energy extraction, but also these two sets of data, which we just saw. On the one hand, there is, in a way, this more or less traditional kind of military surveillance information data set, which is then used for the purpose of conquest and reconnaissance. But on the other hand, there is this different kind of data set, which is connected with these new image generators burning on Promethean fire, which are basically running on large-scale image data sets, which are basically looted or scraped from the internet disrespecting copyright and so on and so on. I will give a lecture specifically about the question of IP in those large-scale data sets in March. So I will basically leave aside this whole topic for now. But I want to focus on another aspect, namely, how does this new data set, how does this relate to the fire of creativity that the CEO of Stable Diffusion promised? First of all, most of these ML renderings are post-photographic, which means that they don't require the impact of sunlight at all anymore. They don't really require any contact with sunlight. They are being rendered. So basically they draw energy instead of being triggered by, the impact of photons. So in that sense, I would like to call them basically contemporary oil paintings. They are being based on fossil energy. We heard that almost 80% of the energy used in contemporary in the internet is still fossil, so they are largely fossil paintings in a way. I couldn't find any numbers on how much energy they really use right now, but one estimate for ChatGPT is $100K a day just to run the service. But I couldn't find any for image generators. But the other point, and here I would like to go back to the thing I already said about NFTs, is that they are basically, I think, also tools of onboarding. They are freebies handed out. You don't have to pay for many of them. You're always able to get a free one if you want to, but they are onboarding tools. But into what? It was very obvious in the case of NFTs that they were onboarding tools into crypto, basically environments. But I think that this kind of environment is a cloud architecture environment which you are supposed to subscribe on a monthly basis, like for example to the Amazon cloud system. It's a rent-based system which drafts you into, or tries to draft you into, a monopolist pipeline system of digital production tools, which is proprietary and which you have to, basically pay or subscribe to and continue paying for it every month. Or as in the case of the Adobe Cloud, you're not able to access your own work anymore. So I think basically that these are onboarding tools into digital production pipelines. And so this is a question here. Here's a rendering of what this kind of pipeline is supposed to look like, just something from the internet. And you see that these people are animating rabbits here, I think. But I think in our case, it should be reindeers, which look at you through the screen, and you're in your digital production pipeline, but you also are dependent on energy from the gas pipeline. And on the other end of the pipeline is a reindeer that's slightly sweating already and a bit desperate because of the conditions. So basically all these pipelines should be merged into one to make the fate of the reindeers and the people that live with them visible. So onboarding into a different system of pipelines through these ML generators possibly happening right now. But the reason why I wanted to show you this historical example at all, of the burned Templehof military surveillance database, etc., was that I think that this is a really good example to remember, that even huge architectures of knowledge and surveillance and material infrastructure can also be overcome and cease to be in existence pretty quickly, and that they can burn, and also the content can basically disappear with the whole system of oppression tied to it. And if you look at the whole airport, then I think it's a partly could be a very optimistic almost outlook into a future in which there are no more airports, into which all the airports have been turned into parks. It's a sort of post-fossil era, but it is also a time in which basically land or real estate is being barred from speculation, is being barred from gentrification, and belongs basically to the citizens through some kind of plebiscite. So basically it's a post-fossil location. It's also a post-fascist one, which would be nice, I think. I mean, it at least shows that it is possible, and it also foreshadows some kind of commons, which could, of course, extend to data, a data commons. And I will expand on this in my next lecture. Data common or large scale data sets turned into data commons. And all of these are basically tools to show that none of this is forever, and that basically all of the current architectures can end pretty soon, and maybe sooner as we think, because as I said in the beginning, the whole landscape is shifting quite dramatically, and we'll just have to see where things go. Thank you.
Thank you, Hito, so much for this. It was fascinating.
Yeah, sorry, I had to improvise a bit because my videos were not working. So I apologize if it was a bit all over the place.
Yay. It was okay. And I apologize for everyone. We did have a sound glitch and we couldn't hear the sound from the videos. And we even started the webinar as we were checking the sound. So my apologies, but because we don't have so much time left and I have so many questions to ask you, and I'm sure other people has a few as well. So I will just jump to it. So you're talking about the apparatus of the poor image in relation to the power image, which is really mind-blowing in so many ways. The power image encompasses a different amount of energy and ways of extraction and political signification. It has a different way of, like a different clarity in its visual clarification, let's say, but a completely different way of accessibility and let's say causality. And in causality, I want to ask mostly about the idea that in power image, the AI or whatever the generator would be, oftentimes loses the noise in the image, right? The noise is what we see many times as the small details that are actually giving a wider context where an image was taken, how was it taken, who's standing behind of the camera, and the whole story basically that makes the image speak. And when we scrape that out, we are left with this trans-epistemic meaning. And I wanna ask you about that in terms of power image. How do you see that in relation to the operativeness of power image, but also how do you see the whole notion of causality that was so much about emancipation with the poor image and operates in a completely different way in power images?
Okay, well, that's a huge question. I'll try to answer small parts of it. Thanks a lot for this. Well, first of all, these diffusion models are actually built as denoising processes. Basically, the algorithm it runs on is a denoising process. You add noise to an image and then you take it away. And basically, this is what is used to regenerate another image. So basically getting rid of noise is the production process, which is kind of interesting already, you know. I mean, there's still enough glitches, etc., in this process is far from, you know, realistic even. But I think it's interesting that denoising or eradicating basically glitches is the foundation of the process as such. As to the relation of the poor image to the power image, I think that if we were trying to think of an equivalent of what a poor image could be now, it would have to be in a way relating to small tech, to minimum viable technical configurations, to in a way self-operated or partly self-operated or federated, decentralized, network configurations, and not be just a part of these massive hierarchical cloud operations that also extract a lot of very precarious labor, attention, and all of that. So basically the whole architecture of communicating to one another would need to be modified. Small tech, green tech. Green tech is a very, very ambivalent term, so I will delete it. But small tech.
Small tech,
Yeah.
open source codes. And
yeah.
We have one more question, but I have to insist and ask a larger question that is kind of like leaping out of the only art discourse, but looks into our existence. So as you mentioned, AI is a pretty much extremist representational mode, right? That sometimes it even overrides its own subject of representation. It's in own ways that it attaches temporality, materiality, context, and causality. But then AI, but then with that, we approach the world, right? And we see things, and we see how the extraction of gas and oil is intertwined with this mode of production. And as you mentioned, it also develops different political processes and instability, or maybe even mines them in many, many places. So do you think it's about time to talk as a society about regulating the internet and creating more transparency about contracts that are taking place between companies like Shell and Chevron to technological corporations like Microsoft and Google and Apple, and of course also in terms of truth and fiction, and if those can be somewhat regulated online? Like, are we in the right moment to talk about regulating the internet?
Well, I've said this for at least a decade, that the tech giants need some sort of regulation, but on the other hand, I've also it's a bit frustrating to demand things that are probably not gonna happen to the extent that I would like them to happen. So basically, we also have to think from the side of the users, right? What can we modify, or what kind of things do we not really need? So it's interesting, in our type of energy crisis, to see that there's a lot of things that actually you don't need. So gas consumption is down almost 40% in the last months, which means that, a lot of the gas consumption was not needed. And I'm really asking myself how much of these ML renderings are needed, honestly. I mean, do all of them have a purpose? How many of these technologies really make sense for anything, really? And do we have to get drafted into these production pipelines, and what for, right? I mean, yes, regulation, by all means, taxation, by all means, but also, plan B and C and D, because this will not happen to the extent that would be required, I think.
Thank you for this. I'm going to ask one question from the audience, wondering why you chose dancers specifically to represent an extractable body in your video about tech and the speed of light.
Yeah, this was mainly about motion capture, right? I mean, this is shot, I think, in 2014, and I was fascinated about different ways to perform motion capture at that time. At that time, people had to wear, body suits with kind of sensors, etc., etc. So there was a whole big rig to extract motion from people for animation, for example, mainly at that time. So motion capture was already a sort of mode of extraction. And then and motion capture, of course, can apply to all sorts of motion, right? Martial, any But yeah, but I happened to, know these protagonists, and I loved also the internet dances of Take Some Crime, TSC, who is the dancer in this video, and then somehow I made up some kind of pretext to have him in the video.
Well, I will, on this note, will end our webinar. And thank you again so much for hosting us and sharing those ideas. It was truly fascinating. And we hope to meet in your next lecture on data.
Okay, thank you so
Thanks
much.
everyone for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.